pawn shop. I would imagine one of the positives of it and one of the negatives is working with family.
I used to say this all the time, like, the best part of my business is working with my family, the worst part is working with my family. Every business needs a dictator.
For years, Pawn Stars looked almost impossible to break. A family pawn shop became a television empire. Rick Harrison became the face of the business. Corey grew up in front of millions of viewers, and the Harrison family seemed locked into a formula that could run forever. Then something changed. The show entered a period of uncertainty. Rick Harrison confirmed that the relationship with history had changed, while Corey made it clear he did not want to keep playing the younger version of himself that viewers had known for years. TV Insider. The strange part is that Pawn Stars did not simply disappear. Episodes continued into 2026. But the family story that made the series feel different was changing from the inside. The TV. And once that happens, the question is no longer simply whether a television show ends. It becomes a much harder question. What happens when the people who built the show no longer want to be the people the audience remembers? When Pawn Stars first appeared in 2009, almost everything about it felt simple. A customer walked through the doors of the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas. They brought something unusual. Maybe it was an old weapon, a piece of sports history, a piece of jewelry, a forgotten object from another time. Rick looked at it. Then came the questions. Where did it come from? Was it real? What was it worth? And, most importantly, how much would the shop be willing to pay? That basic process became television gold. But the objects were only half of the story. The real attraction was the family. Rick was the experienced businessman. Corey was the younger generation trying to prove himself. And Richard, the old man, Harrison represented the older generation, carrying the weight of the business and the family history. Chumlee added another personality to the mix. Together, they created something that did not feel like a normal scripted television cast. It felt like a family workplace that happened to have cameras inside it. That difference mattered. History's own description of Corey shows how deeply the family business idea was built into the series. He started working at the pawn shop when he was only 9 years old and was trained in appraisal and management. The younger Corey was presented as someone who still had something to prove to his father. History 3. For viewers, that created a familiar emotional pattern. The son wanted respect. The father wanted results. The grandfather watched from above it all. Arguments came and went. Deals came and went. But the basic structure remained. For years, viewers could turn on the television and see the same people standing in roughly the same places. That creates comfort. It also creates a trap, because people change even when television does not. And eventually, the person the audience remembers is no longer the person standing in front of the camera. That became especially important after the death of Richard, the old man Harrison, in 2018. His absence did more than remove one cast member. It removed one generation from the center of the story. The show could continue. The shop could continue. Rick could continue. But the family structure had changed. The audience was no longer watching 3 generations work together in the same way. And Corey was no longer the young man who needed to prove himself. He had grown older. The problem was that television audiences do not always grow with the people they watch. They remember moments. They remember personalities. They remember the version of someone who first entered their living room. Corey eventually described that problem in unusually direct terms. In 2025, he said that everyone was playing a character on Pawn Stars and that he could not play another season as a 41-year-old pretending to be 23. He also said that the past few years had been rough and that he was ready to move on. TV Insider. That statement says far more than it appears to say, because Corey was not simply talking about age. He was talking about identity. Think about what happens when millions of people know you through one version of yourself. They know the jokes. They know the arguments. They know the role you played inside the family. They know the younger you, but they do not necessarily know the person you became afterward. That is one of the strange costs of reality television. The audience expects reality. The production still needs continuity. And continuity often means repeating the personalities and relationships that made the show successful. For someone growing older inside that system, the pressure can become uncomfortable. The audience wants the old Corey. Corey has become someone else. That gap is where the story begins to break. And it raises a question worth asking. If you had spent more than a decade building a television show around your family, would you keep doing it because millions of people love the old version of you? Or would you walk away when that version no longer felt honest? There's no easy answer. For Corey, the answer appeared to be moving forward. For Rick, it was different. Rick had spent much of his life inside the pawn business. History describes him as having entered the business at a young age and building his career around the family shop. The television series simply transformed that existing life into something millions of people could watch. History 3. For Rick, the shop was not only a television set. It was the family business. That difference helps explain why the future could look completely different to father and son. Rick could look at the shop and see something that had survived decades. Corey could look at the same place and see years of his life that he was ready to leave behind. Neither view has to be fake. They simply come from different stages of life. And then came another problem. The television relationship itself changed. In 2025, Rick said that Pawn Stars was no longer under contract with History and that they were waiting to see when filming might resume or what would happen next. He even referred to the possibility of Pawn Stars 2.0. Yahoo 4. That phrase matters because it suggests that Rick did not necessarily see the story as finished. He saw the possibility of another version. But another version raises another problem. What exactly would have to change? The family had changed. The cast had changed. The audience had changed. And the old formula could not simply be frozen in time. This is where the popular version of the story becomes too simple. It would be easy to say the show was canceled. It would be easy to say Rick ended it. It would be easy to blame one person. The available evidence does not support that clean explanation. In fact, the series continued to air episodes in 2026. Current listings show the 2026 run, with episodes airing from January through March. So something more subtle happened. The original Pawn Stars' identity began changing. The show itself could survive. The question was whether the same family dynamic could survive with it. And that is a very different story, because television is built around recognizable faces. A network can change a format. It can change a location. It can change the pace. But once viewers become emotionally attached to certain people, removing one of them changes the emotional architecture. The old man was gone. Corey was pulling away. Rick was still willing to work. And Chumlee remained part of the larger Pawn Stars world. That creates a strange middle ground. The show is still alive, but the version people remember is slowly becoming history. And perhaps that is what makes Rick's Pawn Stars 2.0 idea so interesting. A second version would not simply need new episodes. It would need a new reason to exist. The original series worked because the audience could watch the Harrison family negotiate with customers while also negotiating with one another. The business was the setting. The family was the story. Take away enough of that family structure, and the meaning changes. At some point, the audience is no longer watching the same show. They are watching its next chapter. That may be uncomfortable for people who grew attached to the original, but it is also normal. Every long-running television series eventually faces the same problem. People age. People leave. People get married. People move away. People decide they want something different. The camera keeps recording. Life does not wait for the camera. And Corey seemed to understand that. He reportedly moved to Tulum, Mexico, after stepping away from the show's familiar Las Vegas world. He also said he was not planning to return to the series in the form viewers had known. TV Insider. His decision reveals something that television rarely shows clearly. Fame can give someone opportunities, but can also make change harder. When a person becomes famous for being a certain age, having a certain personality, or playing a certain role inside a family, every change can feel like a threat to the brand. Yet aging is not a branding problem in real life. It simply happens. A person who is 23 eventually becomes 30, then 40, then 50. Their priorities shift. Their patience changes. Their definition of success changes. And sometimes the life they once wanted is no longer the life they want now. That is what makes Corey's decision more human than dramatic. He was not necessarily running away from success. He was making room for another version of himself. And that is something almost everyone understands. Most people do not spend their lives on television, but almost everyone has experienced the strange feeling of being remembered for who they used to be. A parent remembers the child. An old friend remembers the teenager. A former employer remembers the younger worker. And sometimes even the people closest to someone can keep seeing an older version of them. That can be difficult because inside, the person knows something has changed. That may be the most relatable part of the entire Pawn Stars story. The audience saw Corey grow up, but Corey had to live through that growth. The audience could switch off the television. He could not switch off the years that had passed. And that is where the human cost of a long-running show becomes clearer. A successful series can preserve a moment, but real life keeps moving. There is another layer to the story. Rick and Chumlee continued developing Pawn After Dark, a podcast connected to the same world of the gold and silver pawn shop, while Corey made it clear that he wanted a different path. TV Insider, too. That contrast tells us something important. Rick was still looking for ways to continue the story. Corey was looking for a life outside it. The two decisions can exist at the same time. One does not automatically cancel the other. And that is why the phrase, "the real reason Pawn Stars ended," needs to be handled carefully. Because the evidence does not point to one explosive ending. It points to evolution. A family member died. A younger generation grew older. A contract reached its end. A cast member decided not to renew. A television format that had survived for years entered another stage. And the people involved began asking different questions. Rick's questions seemed to be, how can this continue? Corey's question was closer to, do I still want this to be my life? Those are very different questions. And when people inside the same family begin answering them differently, change becomes almost unavoidable. If you enjoy stories about the people behind the shows we grew up watching, not just the headlines, consider subscribing. There are more quietly iconic stories where the public image and private reality do not quite match. Because the most interesting part of Pawn Stars may never have been the rare objects. It was the people deciding what those objects were worth. And eventually, the people themselves had to decide what their years on television were worth. That is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because Rick Harrison did not build his identity around television alone. He built around work. The pawn business, his family, the shop. For someone like that, stopping is not as simple as leaving a studio. The shop is still there. The history is still there. The customers are still there. And the cameras can always come back. But Corey had already reached a different point. He had spent most of his life around the same business. He had become famous while still young. He had watched his grandfather become one of television's most recognizable older personalities. He had watched his father become the face of the franchise. And then he had to decide whether he wanted to spend another chapter doing the same thing. His answer was becoming clear. He was ready to move on. That does not mean he hated the show. In fact, his own comments made the opposite clear. He said he had loved filming it and being part of it. But loving something and wanting to keep doing it forever are not the same thing. TV Insider, too. That distinction is easy to miss. Sometimes people leave because something failed. Other times they leave because something succeeded for long enough. The success gave them the freedom to choose something else. And maybe that is what happened here. The strange thing about Pawn Stars is that it did not need to completely disappear for an era to end. The original emotional formula could end while the brand continued. The shop could remain. Rick could remain. The show could continue producing episodes. But the family we first met in 2009 could never be exactly the same. That family existed at one point in time. Television preserved it. Life changed it. And viewers were left watching the distance grow. So was Rick Harrison responsible for ending Pawn Stars? The evidence does not show that. Did one secret decision destroy the series? There is no solid record supporting that either. Was Corey the sole reason? Again, no. The more accurate answer is quieter. The old version of Pawn Stars reached a point where reality itself was changing faster than the television formula. And the people inside that formula had to make choices. Rick wanted to keep building. Corey wanted to move forward. The network relationship changed. The show entered a new phase, and the audience was left with something that happens to every long-running story eventually. The people we met at the beginning are no longer standing in exactly the same place. That is not failure. It is time. And perhaps Rick understood that when he talked about Pawn Stars 2.0. The future did not necessarily have to look like the past. It could be different, maybe leaner, maybe centered around Rick and Chum-Li, maybe built around new personalities, maybe something the audience has not seen yet. The important point is that a new version would have to accept one uncomfortable truth. It cannot bring the old family back exactly as they were. No television deal can reverse aging. No network contract can restore the past. No camera can bring back the people who are gone. And no audience can remain frozen in the year they first discovered a show. That may be the real story behind the change. Not a secret betrayal. Not one dramatic argument. Not one person pulling the plug. Just time doing what time always does. Changing the people inside the picture. Pawn Stars began as a story about objects. A watch. A painting. A weapon. A piece of history. People walked into the shop carrying things they believed had value. Rick and his family tried to determine what those things were really worth. Years later, the same question seems to have turned back toward the people themselves. What was the cost of being famous? What was the value of staying? What was the value of leaving? And how much of yourself can you keep when millions of people want you to remain the person they first met? Que les choses changent. Rick chose continuation. And the show, in one form or another, kept moving. That is why saying Pawn Stars simply ended misses the deeper story. Something did end. The original version of the family dynamic ended. The younger Corey ended. The era of the three-generation family at the center of the story ended. But the television machine did not necessarily end with it. It changed, and perhaps that is the most fitting ending for a show built around judging the value of things. Because after all these years, the biggest item being appraised is no longer a rare object sitting on the counter. It is the past itself. And Rick Harrison may still have one more chapter to write. But there is another question waiting behind that chapter. If Pawn Stars can survive without the family dynamic that made millions of viewers care in the first place, what exactly is the show becoming? And that question leads to another quietly fascinating television story. One where a beloved family business survived, but the people who made it famous discovered that fame had a price they could no longer ignore.